And just as a reminder to our audience and panelists, we will be recording this meeting. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kavi Katuba, and I'm a rising freshman at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. I'm here today with my partners, Brian Zhao, who is a rising sophomore at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, and Yifan Li, who is a rising sophomore at Poolsville High School. We are part of the program BranchOut. BranchOut is a nonprofit program with Veritas Education Leaders that was co-founded by Dr. Yuxin Wu and Mr. Richard Wang in 2015, and grew from 20 student volunteers to over 150 student volunteers in 4 short summers. Our high school student mentors came from over 40 different schools across 4 states.
We started out as a peer STEM mentoring program working at the community centers, homeless shelters, and county summer credit recovery programs, and have expanded into a community outreach program to promote cross-cultural understanding by featuring community heroes, creating research articles, and organizing career panels. As an award-winning community engagement program, we have received endorsement from the U.S. Congress, including Senator Tim Kaine and the former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock. Additionally, our innovative program won the U.S. Congressional App Challenge Award last year.
As part of BranchOut's goals to promote civic engagement, community, and STEM education, we are so excited to be presenting this very informative career panel. The topic for today, as you may have heard, is international relations and diplomacy. International relations reflects a vast study focused on the interactions of nations on the world stage. The study envelopes anything from economic interactions to political alliances and policymaking. International relations and diplomacy remains especially important in this day and time to connect countries together and examine current world affairs, impactful decisions to take, immigration policies, refugee action, and more. Without the strength of our international relations and diplomacy fields, our economy would suffer, war would be frequent, and international organizations such as the World Health Organization and the United Nations would not play the vital role that they do today in maintaining health and peace. Today, we have 3 guest panelists speaking. One of our featured panelists who will be speaking for us tonight is Richard Boucher. Professor Boucher teaches diplomacy and foreign policy to Brown University graduate and undergraduate students as a senior fellow in the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Professor Boucher, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. This teaching business for me is a second career. I spent 32 years in the Foreign Service, spending a lot of my time in China and a lot of the time as spokesman at the State Department for 6 different secretaries of state. I went to college at Tufts University, but I studied English and French, and really the only thing I learned in college was how to write. But that really served me well in my career. And then I went to Peace Corps, and I spent 2 years in Africa with Peace Corps, and I think that was probably the best thing that I ever did. And happy to encourage everybody to join Peace Corps if you get a chance.
Thank you, Professor Boucher. Our second speaker will be Susan Elliott. Ambassador Elliott is a highly accomplished diplomat of 27 years, serving as foreign policy advisor to the U.S. European Command. Now she serves as the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Ambassador Elliott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Brian, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to participate tonight. One of the nice things when you told me about the panel is Ambassador Boucher was a colleague of mine at the State Department. So we both were career U.S. Foreign Service officers, diplomats, served in somewhat similar areas. I think I first met you, Richard, was in Hong Kong when you were there, and I came with President Clinton back in the 1990s when he visited. But most of my career, I focused on countries of former Soviet Union and Europe. I served twice in Moscow, Russia. I was U.S. ambassador to Tajikistan, which is a country of former Soviet Union that borders on Afghanistan. But I've also served in Greece. I served in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I served in a variety of careers and assignments in Washington. And I would tell you that I'm an example of someone who didn't major in international relations while I was a graduate student and undergraduate, but it served me well. And I think one of the things Ambassador Boucher mentioned is he learned how to write when he was in college. I think communicating both in writing and being able to verbally communicate are extremely important characteristics for any diplomat. So I look forward to talking with all of you this evening about the importance of diplomacy.
Thank you, Ambassador Elliott. Our third speaker is Jaiya Lalla. Ms. Lalla is a Senior Global Education Manager of UNA-NCA's Global Classrooms DC. Ms. Lalla, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you so much, Ifan. I'm so honored to be here against such distinguished panelists. I am, like Ifan said, the Senior Global Education Manager at the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, which is a local nonprofit that works on advocacy between US and UN relations. Compared to our other great panelists here, I'm actually just starting out with my career. I have a couple of experiences working in government in the NGO space as primarily an intern, but the space I'm in right now, I will say, is my first job ever out of college. I did major in international affairs, so happy to be here and happy to speak with you all today.
Thank you for introducing yourself, Professor Boucher, Ambassador Elliott, and Ms. Lalla. We are thrilled to have you all with us this evening, and I'm sure you will provide excellent information regarding international relations and diplomacy for all of us. We have pre-planned questions aimed towards all the speakers and a few specific questions regarding each of your specific experiences. During this time, if anyone in the audience thinks of any questions, please type them in the chat to everyone and we will get to them later. Audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions for our panelists at the end as well. These questions will be for all three panelists. Professor Boucher, if you could answer the question first, followed by Ambassador Elliott and Ms. Lalla, that would be great. Let's begin. Brian will give our first question.
What is the current crisis that the field as a whole faces, and what is being done to solve it?
Sorry, give me that once again.
Yeah, sure. What is the current crisis that the field faces, and what is being done to solve it?
Oh, how cynical an answer would you like? I think foreign policy in a way is kind of been in a process of re-examination for the last 10, 20 years, and especially now. In a way, the Cold War was fairly straightforward. You know who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And after 9/11, we had a new set of bad guys. And so whether it's military action or foreign policy action or even national, helping countries develop, it was all so that they could build healthy societies that would protect them from terrorism, right? But I think, with the disillusionment with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and with new technologies, new kinds of attacks, new kinds of encroachments, new kinds of issues, I think there's a whole lot of, thinking about what's the role of diplomats and how can you manage national security and national development in different ways, with new technologies, with new adversaries, with new potentials for people around the world.
I mean, I would probably agree with what Professor Boucher's had to say. I think one of the things, the challenges for US diplomats and diplomats around the world is trying to deal with how the world has changed. And I think new technologies, I'll give you an example. In my last assignment when I worked at the US European Command, a lot of what we talked about is when you think about military actions, someone my age thinks about a traditional military action, would be people on the ground fighting what would be a ground war or an air war. But, you know, in the future, I think we have to think about the kinds of attacks that we have seen, you know, whether they're in cyberspace or there are other kinds of new technologies that I think we all need to adapt with and deal with. And I also think that some of the transnational threats that, again, aren't traditional. When, again, I was a diplomat, I thought of a transnational threat as a terrorist organization, someone like Al-Qaeda who attacked the United States on 9/11. But today, transnational threats can be, again, either created or can be something like what we are facing now and have faced over the last year, which is a pandemic. And how do we all work together to try to prevent that kind of a threat from happening in the future? So one of the things that I didn't mention when I introduced myself is what I'm doing now is running a nonprofit organization that's based on foreign policy. And what we do is conduct track 2 discussions. So these are dialogues that we conduct between scholars, former diplomats, and others in countries, usually countries in conflict, but not always, but to have another way of bringing people together when governments, for example, won't be talking to each other. So one example of the track 2 discussions we do are between mainland China and Taiwan. But back in the 1990s, we did discussions on Northern Ireland. So those are a couple of things that I do now. And I do think that we need to think a lot about, you know, how can diplomacy be more effective for your generation in the future?
Yeah, just to echo what fellow panelists have said, I think a lot of the players are changing right now, and a lot of the technologies and the institutions we're used to are now facing kind of areas of change in ways that we don't know how to approach. So just to give an example that is most relevant to me, the United Nations, especially in this time of the pandemic, we've seen the United Nations honestly fail to respond in a way that's been productive and has failed to kind of allocate the needs that are necessary to respond to this pandemic. For example, the UN Security Council at the beginning of the pandemic failed to hastily call a ceasefire. It took them months to be able to do that. So we're seeing this period where things are changing rapidly and our institutions are almost kind of forced to adapt and change, but we're not seeing them change. So I think in that space, in that regard, it's not necessarily a threat, but I think the persistence and kind of the unknown nature of what the future is going to hold is kind of putting these institutions and these organizations in a crossroads of what kind of tackling what they're used to versus tackling what they're not used to.
Thank you so much. Those are very interesting answers, and it's great to see how you all agree. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about this field, especially how the US focus changes over time. Our next question is, what is the job market like for international relation major students?
If you want me to start, I can start this time, so Professor Boucher doesn't have to start each time. But
Go ahead.
I think it depends. There are a lot of, I think, opportunities for people who are involved in international relations. I guess traditionally, someone like me would think about, okay, well, you need to work for the US government or work for a multilateral organization like the UN. But the organization that I work for now, again, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group based in New York. Of course, I'm the oldest person at the organization, but everyone who works for me are probably late 20s, early 30s, and they have master's degrees and in international relations. So I think there are lots of different kinds of opportunities, whether you work for a nonprofit. You can also, if you're interested, teach, and I think Ambassador Boucher could speak more about that. So I think over the past few years, I've been discouraged to see that people haven't been encouraged maybe to look for careers as diplomats. In fact, discouraged, but for me, I thought it was a fantastic career, and I got to go around the world. I got to meet a lot of very interesting people and be involved in a lot of interesting work. So I would encourage all of you, if you're interested in a career working as a diplomat or in the U.S. government, to please consider it.
Jaiya, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think what's important to keep in mind is the field itself is so broad. I think when we think of international affairs, sometimes we do tend to get almost pigeonholed into thinking, you can only go into the US government. I can honestly say when I decided to pursue a career in international affairs, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I did a lot. I think internships really helped me and exposed me to the world of international affairs and what the field particularly looks like. So yes, there's definitely the government track. You can go to the Foreign Service, you can become a civil servant, but there's also a lot of kind of careers you can pursue that might not necessarily be related to international affairs in the title, but I think you can apply that global perspective to kind of anything that you're doing, which is really important to keep in mind. So going into things like international law, international business, really touching at the cornerstone of your interests if you're looking at combining that international affairs level to something that you're looking at. I personally work at a nonprofit. Model UN was the reason I pursued my career, and I'm giving back to that same way through my current job. I teach kids about Model UN, or I teach kids about global issues through Model UN. So it's my way of giving back and also applying my international affairs degree. So I think, like I said, what is really important to keep in mind is the field is so open and there's so many different opportunities that you can be exposed to.
I obviously I agree with what went before me. It really is a huge set of opportunities, and it's not just majoring in international relations. Sort of everybody I know that's risen to whatever profession it is has some international experience, has to have some international experience. My wife was head of government relations for Procter & Gamble company, and she did diplomacy the way I do diplomacy. They'd go into countries, they'd talk to people and try to influence things in the direction that the corporation, needed, wanted, or, could profit from or could help people with. I know I talked to a physicist a while back, a woman who worked on the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. And I said, how do you guys decide what to do? And she said, well, we get 100 physicists in a room, we all scream and yell at each other and put out ideas. And then we finally sit down and start making deals and come up with our list of projects. And I thought, that's a lot like the UN. That's pretty much what the rest of us do. So I think, if you major in something else and have, both language and some international background, you will be in a much better position in that career and may end up doing essentially a diplomatic work. And if you major in international relations, it's good to know other things as well, because other things more and more, you got to get involved with. As we said, there's all these new issues out there. There's, cybersecurity, and how do you negotiate on that? How do you handle ransomware attacks? How do you handle nuclear proliferation and nuclear negotiations? When we negotiated a nuclear deal with India, we had a chemical engineer on our team because somebody had better know the science. And the more science the negotiator knows, the better off he's going to be in terms of trying to work things out. So I think it's no longer just international relations. It's international relations, maybe with some other knowledge on the side, or it's some other field with an international angle to it.
Thank you so much for your responses. I wouldn't have considered how the market is changing. I totally agree that international relations and diplomacy is truly a large field, and it's great to explore the different careers before you decide what you want to work on. I'm also glad to hear that you guys incorporate so many other career fields in your work. Also, Ms. Lalla, I just wanted to add, I think it's great how you used Model UN as a source of inspiration. I believe you have worked with some kids at my school before. And what you're doing is amazing. It really helps people pursue a career in this field, and it inspires people to make a change. Yifan will give our next question.
The next question is, what inspired you to pursue a career in international relations?
I can go ahead and start just because I pretty much already answered this question. So in high school, I did Model UN. I didn't realize international affairs or doing anything that had to do with the world could be a potential career path. I grew up in a small town in Florida, so I wasn't really exposed to those kinds of things. So I decided to kind of buck up and get my undergraduate in international affairs. Don't regret it. Definitely I'm now kind of have my life coming in full circle because I'm giving back to the same students and having that same impact on them.
I think, I mean, first of all, I think Model UN is a really important program, and I actually work with some of the students who do this at the University of New Haven. And so it's a good way of sort of testing the waters and getting a feel for what this is all about and getting a feel for what you might need to know. I got into this, in a way it was just absolutely normal and logical for me because my grandpa was a diplomat. And I grew up with his stories of, Barcelona and Dublin, and my dad's stories of growing up in Rome. And, my grandpa's stories of being in China in the 1940s. So in a way, it was logical. So I went to college thinking I wanted to be a diplomat. And then I decided that I really wanted to be a comparative literature professor and spent 3 or 4 years working on that and applying to grad schools. And I got into Peace Corps and I went to Africa and sat in the African sun for 2 years and realized, no, after all, I did really want to be a diplomat. So I took the exam, and on my second try, I managed to get in.
Well, I would just tell you, I'm the third of the 3 who have been involved in Model UN, and my son was very active in Model UN when he went to Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, and so I definitely was involved in that and chaperoned trips to all the conferences and everything. So it's a fantastic way to get involved in trying to understand, governments. And in my organization, we have done some volunteering with Model UN here around the New York City area. But I'm going to tell you all a little secret about me is that I have no background in education, at least in international relations. I joined the Foreign Service because my husband joined the Foreign Service. And at the time, back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was really difficult to have a career that you could take around with you. There wasn't really the internet, and I wanted a career of my own. And after my husband joined the Foreign Service, I'd said, hey, I could do that job too. So anyway, I joined the Foreign Service, and then we juggled our 2 careers together. And we spent a lot of time in Washington so that we could get 2 assignments together because we couldn't, there's a thing called nepotism, and we couldn't supervise each other. So we spent a lot of time in Washington. But my background, and I have a doctorate, I have a PhD from Indiana University in nursing. So I had a whole background in healthcare before I joined the Foreign Service. And fortunately for me, the Foreign Service wouldn't hire me as a healthcare professional. So I said, okay, I'll just be a diplomat instead. And that's why I go back to what, what Professor Boucher said about being able to communicate, because to me, diplomacy is all about communication and trying to understand and communicate the US government point of view, but then also, you communicate if you're in a foreign country, whether you're the ambassador or the political counselor, you want to communicate back to Washington what you're hearing from people, not only on the ground, but in the government, and not only verbal communication, but again, being able to write so that people will read and understand what you're saying. So anyway, I'm a good example of don't be afraid to change your career, because I joined the Foreign Service when I was 38 years old. So it was really a second career for me. And I was pretty successful. I became an ambassador and really enjoyed every minute of my foreign service career.
Thank you for all of your responses. I believe that our audience found that advice really valuable, especially on how extracurriculars like Model UN are really great for finding your own, to how even with vastly different backgrounds, the field is so expansive enough to encompass all of them, and how you all give back to the field now. I think this is great advice to those who want to pursue a career in international relations. The next question is, what advice would you give to someone who is interested in this field and would like to pursue a career in it?
Okay, I'm going to start, I think. Yeah. I guess two things. One is learn languages. And the second thing is go somewhere and do something. Don't just study it in school. Go to Peace Corps, sign up with an NGO, work in the field for the United Nations. They have some volunteers too. Whatever you can do. I mean, go to your grandpa's village and teach English. If your grandpa is from Kansas, then go to somebody else's grandpa's village and teach English. But just go somewhere out in the world, do something, because it's a learning experience of how to relate to other people who are not like you, who didn't come from the same circumstances or economic background. And B, it's a way to learn a language a whole lot better than anybody else. And C, it kind of shows any future employer that you can deal with the world. And whether you end up being a chemical engineer or a foreign service officer or a development expert that wants to work on development projects, having been there and sort of experienced poverty, experienced different parts of the world, experienced cultures that are not like your own, been away from your family, all those things come into play. And if you show you can do that at some point, then you're going to be a whole lot better, more employable. And I think also you'll have more focus on what you're really trying to do in the job. My experience in Peace Corps was, as I said, the most important thing I ever did. And the reason was I knew people, and I knew people who were very, very poor. And whenever I did something in the Foreign Service, I tried to keep in mind those people in the villages and how was this going to affect them? And was it going to be good for them or bad for them? And that's sort of personalizes the policy and doesn't make it some sort of manufactured grand strategy like people do in Washington.
I mean, I probably agree with Professor Boucher. And the one thing that I would say, people sometimes, especially if you're a US diplomat, think about, well, what's your career path and what do you need to do to be successful? But I always found that I would look for things to do because at least within the Foreign Service, there are many specialty areas. You could be a political officer. I was a political officer. You could be an economic officer. That's what my husband was. But we have public affairs, management, consular work. And I think what I did, and I think that's probably what made me successful, is that I didn't just determine that I was going to do what I thought would be career enhancing for me. I looked for jobs that I thought would be interesting. And in fact, many times, because I wanted jobs with my husband, I took the job that didn't really seem to be career enhancing, but I think it helped me because it gave me a very broad background. So even though I'm a political officer, I did economic work, I did consular work, I did management work. And when I was US Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, most of my work there was public affairs. So there are a variety of things that you could do, but I do agree that, learning, going to another country, getting to learn and experience things that are outside of your comfort zone really, I think, make you more successful as whether it's a diplomat or you have a career. For example, if you worked at the UN or any kind of multilateral organization, you need to understand differing points of view and other cultures and other people.
So I won't say more of the same, but I will say I definitely agree. Learning a language is definitely key to kind of being successful in this field. I'm going to focus more on kind of getting your name out there. And two things kind of come to mind is write as much as you can. As we've heard a lot in this panel, writing is definitely key to being successful in this field, whether that's writing for your local school newspaper, or writing for a local blog. Write as much as you can. At UNA-NCA, we have opportunities for students like yourselves to write. It doesn't matter like if you have the experience, if you don't, we will guide you through writing a blog post, getting yourself published on our blog. Happy to talk more on that if anyone is interested. But yeah, write as much as you can. The second thing I would say is getting to know people in careers that you want to be in. This is professionally known as networking, but the earlier you start it, the better, because you're going to start getting your name out there to people. So whenever you're getting ready to start in the field, if you're not pursuing kind of the government side, if you're wanting to go into more of the think tank or the nonprofit space, they're going to be the person that you call when or the person that calls you when a position opens up. So just to give a tidbit on what networking is, because I didn't know until I started college, it's just getting to know kind of who is working in the field, who's working in careers, and really understanding the trajectory of how they ended up into those particular positions. A lot of the times it's really beneficial to understand all of the different backgrounds that people are coming from, and kind of what steps they took to be able to be, in that dream role of yours, and what steps, they can advise to you, or maybe they can mentor you to help you get to where you want to be. So yeah, those are the two things I would kind of wrap up saying: writing and then also networking.
Thank you so much for your answers. Those are great. I love your tips on learning a new language. That must be very valuable in a diplomatic career, especially. And it's amazing how you three highlighted taking an initiative to further explore different organizations that specialize in this field, networking with professionals, and actually visiting other countries. Our next question is targeted for Professor Boucher. When you worked for the US in the Foreign Service as a career ambassador, what difficulties did you face?
Not everybody likes us. And you have to learn how to deal with people. I used to say I like to talk to people who disagree with me. And I ended up doing a lot of that. I spent a lot of time tromping around Central Asia dealing with corrupt dictators. I spent a lot of time in China dealing with dedicated communist cadre. I spent a lot of time in India and places like that, where there's generally people generally like Americans, but they don't always like what we do, and so you get a lot of criticism of what we're doing in the Middle East, or why can't we do more for these people here, et cetera. And and then you have Central Asia, you have Russians and Gazprom and various various people working against you. In China, you get to know people, and then suddenly you'd find out they've been picked up by the security police and told not to talk to foreigners. So it can be difficult sometimes. I think the personal interaction is the most rewarding part of the job, and yet sometimes it's often the most difficult, because you really got to think about people. You can't just think about how they're going to react. I mean, they're foreigners, so they're thinking differently. Their priorities are different. Some of them are corrupt. Some of them are, against you. And you got to sort of think about what you're saying in a different way. How are they going to take it? How do you influence people in the right direction? Not just, get there and sort of broadcast your message and go home.
Thank you for your answer about the challenges that diplomats face, especially like criticism and disagreements and the difficulty to talk to people, especially since they have different ideas from you. And this really highlights the importance for diplomats in this era. So the next question is to Ambassador Elliott. We have read about your work as a civilian deputy and foreign policy advisor. Can you describe the policies you've worked on with other countries?
Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about my assignment. I was the civilian deputy to the US European commander. And that person is also the what's called the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. So wears two hats, is head of NATO, but also head of US forces in Europe. And what I did, one thing that's an assignment that foreign service officers can have is that we can be diplomatic advisors or political advisors and have an assignment with and be embedded with the military. And likewise, military officers can come to the State Department and be military advisors and work at state over their career. So what I did was I worked on a lot of different policies at the time. Again, they were all focused on sort of US relations with our European allies. But at the time that I went there, it was 2015. It was right after the Russians had annexed Crimea. And so there was a lot of real change in how not only the US, but the Europeans were going to deal with Russia. Because after the fall of the Soviet Union, I served twice in Moscow. First was after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992 to 94, and then I went back in 2009. But, you know, at the time between the fall of the Soviet Union and then I'll say the invasion of, the annexation of Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, I think we maybe had the idea that, I think we did in terms of US European Command, is that we could be partners with Russians and try to work together on issues. Then that all changed in 2014. So a lot of what I worked on was how do we get the Europeans to work together? What kind of a threat is Russia? Is Russia a threat to Europe like the former Soviet Union was? I think Ambassador Boucher said at the beginning, you know, it seemed a lot easier back in the Cold War days because certain people were the enemy and certain people were what we considered to be the good guys. Well, the lines were all blurred. So I actually enjoyed that because I had served twice in Russia. I think I had a perspective that others didn't have because I felt like I understood. Didn't mean I agreed with what you know our colleagues or friends might do from Russia, but I could at least understand why would Putin do something the way he did. Doesn't mean I agreed with it, but you know, and it helped if you can figure out perhaps your adversary where they're coming from, it maybe can help you to deal with them better. And in the end, what we were looking for was not to have a military confrontation, but to look for ways that we could, you know, work together with our allies in Europe and confront the perceived or the real threats that we saw, you know, coming from Russia. So that's a lot of what I did during that. And then I also represented the commander because he had so much to do. So I would go and meet with the military colleagues. For example, in Greece, I had served in Greece. So I went several times to Greece and was the senior representative and went with other military colleagues from the US European Command. And just one other little factoid about the European Command, it was based in Germany, but a combatant command includes representatives from all of the services. So it was very interesting for me to be in a situation where I had colleagues from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, all together. We even had some Coast Guard people there, and they worked together. So it really helped me to understand how complex and interesting the US military is.
Thank you for sharing. It's really interesting to see how not only NATO's policy directions and paradigms have shifted over your career, but also to your interactions with the military and their branches, and to the role you played in understanding other actors and shaping NATO policy. This question is for Ms. Lalla. Can you describe a day in your life as the Senior Global Education Manager of the Global Classrooms DC program?
Of course. Yeah, I can't say I have a typical day in my life. I think I started this job in June of 2020. So as you can imagine, working with schools and trying to do Model UN programs right in the middle of the pandemic and trying to adapt the entire program was a lot of my job. But really what it all comes down to is kind of the materials that we pump out. Like I said, my program really focuses on educating the youth of tomorrow on different global issues. So a lot of it is content creation centered around Model UN. So that's the background guides that you guys read before a Model UN conference. That's the activities that you do, the simulations that you do. So that's a lot of kind of the content creation side. But what I think kind of my favorite part of the job will be is the fact that we're able to really take advantage of the fact that we live right in the center of the nation's capital, and we're able to use all of those resources to elevate the student experience. So what I really mean by that is we actually get to work with the local UN agencies and the State Department and the Pan American Health Organization to build out the content that we provide for our program, but also bring those experts directly to students like yourself. So I'm sure as a lot of you are Model UN students, I'm sure you've all thought, one day I want to work at the UN or I want to be a part of the UN. So we're really bringing that to the ground in the classroom through webinars, through simulations, through these experts serving as policy advisors. And then also helping you guys get exposed to the world of diplomacy. Our conferences in a usual in-person setting would take place at the State Department or the Pan American Health Organization, where ambassadors and diplomats are actually sitting and debating these issues. So it's kind of another part of my job. And then third facet is directly communicating to students and educators to make sure we're bringing the most relevant and the most up-to-date experience as we can. Like I said, working for the last year in the pandemic hasn't been easy, but we've been able to implement a lot of feedback and really elevate the conference experiences, as well as expand our jurisdiction over the last year.
Thank you for answering. It sounds like you have a really busy day, especially with the pandemic and everyone trying to fit with their own schedule, and especially for you creating content and working in Model UN with different students, and also working with officials and other organizations, which is really cool. And so thank you for sharing, and it was really great information for our audience. And we also have to thank Professor Boucher and Ambassador Elliott for the valuable advice and insight that you two have given as well. And at this point, if any members in the audience have any questions or clarifications for our panelists, please feel free to type them in the chat box.
And if you don't want to type it into the main chat, you can always privately DM me. So our first audience question is, do you think it is possible for countries to work together to address climate change? If so, in what practical ways?
Yes.
I would say yes too. I think the challenge is to figure out how, we're going to work together. But I think not only is it it's absolutely necessary that we figure out a way to work together, because this is an issue maybe that we didn't mention when we talked about, diplomacy of the future, but this is a good example of a transnational that your generation, my generation, we're all going to face, and we need to figure out ways to work together on it.
I'd say a couple of things here. One is there's global climate negotiations, these huge, the Paris Agreement and all the follow-up talks. And so, every year there's a meeting, every year they try to do something more. Countries push each other, kick each other, yell at each other, and get together on pacts and say, okay, I'll do more. But the interesting thing about that is it's not just countries. Oftentimes it's corporations that make pledges. It's the cities and states. During the Reagan presidency, the president and his administration couldn't have cared less. But yet there was this huge sort of collection of American governors and mayors who would go to the climate talks and say, here's what we can do to cut emissions and protect the planet. The other thing is that the global climate talks aren't the only way that things happened. Some of the earliest climate action was U.S.-Canada on nitrogen and what do you call it? Coal, emissions.
Acid rain.
Acid rain problems. It's part of almost every agreement now. There's climate elements in free trade agreements. So it's become sort of a constant effort, constant diplomatic effort, but then also a corporate effort and a town and city effort to push things forward. And then the other is there's other ways that people are addressing climate problems. One of there's an agreement on the ozone layer, and they hammered out a new agreement a couple of years ago. So people are getting rid of chlorofluorocarbons in refrigerants to protect the ozone layer, and then they're taking it another step. And then they found suspicious emissions coming out of China, so they were able to sort of organize specific action against, and then eventually with the Chinese, to find out where those emissions came from and get them stopped. So there are a lot of different ways that people do this, and while the focus is on the Paris Agreement and the clauses and parameters of that, there's so much more going on climate, right down to the choices that people all over the world are making on what kind of car to buy. And so anybody in any of these industries that has, that touches on climate, is probably taking climate action.
Yeah, I think Professor Boucher hit on such an important point of this entire climate battle that we're doing is everyone's action has a consequence. So even though, we have all these governments, we have the corporations, we have the companies doing the high level negotiations, never underestimate the power of your own voice and your own actions. You have youth like yourself actually creating and mobilizing tangible change. So even whether that's, going with your local communities and educating them, on what are the best practices of recycling, or what are the best practices to be sustainable. Those are going to make all the difference in this battle against climate.
Yeah, even things as simple as what we eat and making, decisions about what are sustainable things that we can eat, how we travel. As Ambassador Boucher said, what kind of car you buy. I think they're all small things. You think, well, can I make a difference as one or two people? And I think the answer is yes. And it's true. It can go from the top down, but also from the bottom up as well.
Thanks for your valuable input on how it's not only multilateral, but also bilateral negotiations at the national scale, but also personal proactivity in taking steps to reduce global emissions. The next question is, have US international relations faced setbacks from previous administrations? And if so, how long do setbacks normally occur, and what actions could be taken to normalize them?
All right, I'm going to jump in on this one. This is the stink bomb question.
Yeah.
This is the way of asking about Trump without asking about Trump. So I'm going to answer. And I'm not a spokesman for anybody anymore except for me. I'm the only person who's responsible for what I say. And the answer is yes. We go through periods when people are kind of appalled by what we do. And it's not just Donald Trump. It's not just Donald Trump, attacking every ally we've got with a steel tariff or an aluminum tariff. It's not just Donald Trump throwing away decades of work on climate and trade. And it's not just Donald Trump sort of trying to build a wall with our best friend and closest neighbor, or one of our best friends and closest neighbors. You can't block the Canadians out, but building a wall with Mexico is pretty pretty in-your-face kind of action, and especially the way he did it. So, but if you've, one thing about getting old is you've seen it all before, and in some ways we have seen this before. The world was appalled by Ronald Reagan when he came in the early 1980s. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He, did all kinds of stuff. It really scared people. And yet, looking back now, we and others think of him as one of the greatest presidents we've had in terms of foreign policy. The man who stood up to the Soviet Union, but was also willing to deal with Mikhail Gorbachev when Gorbachev came along. And eventually, the guy who put enough irons in the fire, both in terms of challenging the Soviets, but also cooperating with him where he could, that the Soviet Union fell apart. Millions of people gained their freedom. The world was certainly appalled by George W. Bush and the Iraq War. And yet when Barack Obama was voted in, everybody around the world started clapping and forgiving us. And in some ways, the world wants to forgive the Americans for our stupidities, our occasional stupidities. Because there's still stuff here that we do, that we can do for them, that people look up to. So, yeah, how long does it take? God, I don't know. In some ways it takes, takes one election cycle, but it doesn't really. It makes people in the future more nervous about negotiating with us, more nervous about trusting us, more nervous about relying on us for their security. So everybody, now, no matter how much they like Biden's foreign policies and what the government's doing now, they're all kind of hedging their bets a little bit because they don't know what's going to happen next. And so during the Cold War, we were utterly predictable. We were absolutely rock solid in our convictions, no matter who the president was. After the Cold War, it's been harder to predict what we were going to do. And I think that makes it a little more difficult. It takes longer to get over.
I mean, I would probably agree with everything that Professor Boucher said. It's really hard to predict, and you don't know what's going to happen next and how we will react to things. But I do think, and it's not just from President Trump. I think he did a lot of damage to our relations, especially with our allies around the world. But I think that we need to be seen as a reliable partner. And one of the beauties of democracy is that our government and our leaders do turn over. But I think one of the things that the reason that perhaps we were seen as a good friend and partner in the past was that we could be relied on, even if we had a change in government, to at least continue on with many of the policies that were started by the previous administration. So I think that's one of the important things, especially for me, having dealt a lot with our European allies and colleagues. They're a little bit nervous about what will the future hold. And again, it's not really centered in one person, say President Trump, but there were how many? 75 million people who voted and support his policy. So it shows you that who knows who our next president, who our leader will be. But I think it's important, at least from my perspective, to nurture and maintain relationships with our partners and allies around the world, because democracy, as we've all seen, is fragile. And I will say, I was serving in Belfast, Northern Ireland when President Obama was elected. And, people in the UK did not like President Bush, and they did not like that the UK had been kind of drawn into the Iraq war. So they were very happy to forgive us when they saw a new president be elected. So I hope that kind of feeling around the world. I will say I've served in difficult countries. I served and know all those people in Central Asia because I was a US ambassador there. And one of the things I liked about Northern Ireland was it was a place where people really still liked and enjoyed people from the US. So
yeah, I can't really comment too much on there just because I haven't worked directly in the diplomacy field, but I think you guys both hit the nail on the head that, you know, it really with the US, we have this turnover every 4 years with the election cycle, or 8 years if someone is reelected. And that's kind of the key to understanding how our foreign policy is kind of directed.
Thank you for sharing. We appreciate how you highlighted not only how our presence can damage our international relations, but even more so how these relations can rebond. Our next question is, what do you think is the greatest barrier to international cooperation in the present age?
I mean, one thing that I would just mention is, and it's something we alluded to at the beginning, but it has to do with something that Jaiya mentioned, is about these successful, say, multilateral organizations and even regional organizations that we have. A lot of them were formed after the Second World War. And for example, the UN, you know, the world has changed. And I think one of the things that I'd like to see is that multilateral organizations, which I think are extremely important, look for ways to change with the times. If you think about all you Model UN aficionados, you think about, you know, the Security Council and how it was formed, and China and Russia, and, you know, Germany was out, Japan was out because of the results of the Second World War. The world has changed, and perhaps the way that organizations work, you know, needs to be rethought. That's a kind of a difficult order because it's hard to change. And even NATO, I can tell you that NATO, you know, I was thought of as a security organization, but NATO's come out with a new report called, you know, NATO 2030, and they're looking at being more political perhaps than we may have thought that NATO would have been when it was formed, again, after the fall of the Soviet, or after the Second World War, as a deterrent to the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union disappeared, and then what's the purpose of NATO? So I think NATO has been changing over, you know, the past 25 to 30 years since the Soviet Union fell apart. But I think organizations need to change with the times.
Yeah, and to just echo that, I think a lot of what we're seeing in the United States today is there's a lot of these practices and institutions that have been put in place that we're now coming to terms with that may not be the best. So we're unlearning a lot of things, and that unlearning is really uncomfortable. And a lot of people aren't comfortable with going through that process. We saw that in the last year with critical race theory. We have schools around the world who are refusing to teach critical race theory and refusing to acknowledge our history in the United States. And that's not just here, that's all around the world. So we're there's ignorance that's being preached all around the world that's going to be more detrimental for global affairs. So I think that is a pretty big challenge to kind of overcome, to understand, you know, the world is changing, and there's a lot of things that have been in practice that may not have been, you know, the best things that we have done. We need to own up to it. We need to understand why we did those things, and then also understand what a good path forward would be.
I'll build on what both of you said, Ambassador Elliott and Lalla. I think the biggest obstacle to successful diplomacy in the modern world is professional diplomats. The idea that there are certain people who do this and who negotiate everything and who relate to other countries, and everybody else, you know, I don't know what they do, they fix the plumbing or something like that. And the sort of attempt to keep the negotiations and discussions within a closed sphere, and to keep talking about and repeating the things that we've always been doing, is very detrimental, and it's got to open up. It's got to open up to other expertise. It's got to open up to civil society. It's got to open up to the public debate and discussion. It's got to open up to sort of other things that people can do across borders and between countries that don't rely on professional diplomacy to organize them or professional diplomacy to set up the channels. So somehow incorporating all that other interaction and all those other people who contribute to relations between different countries, whether it's politicians or experts or, NGO types, getting all those people involved in the process and sort of figuring out how to move the whole thing along. I think that's a real problem, a real challenge, and that if you try to leave too much in the hands of tight circles, you're not going to get there.
Thank you all for your responses about how the field as a whole needs to move forward. And an important thing that you guys have mentioned is that the world is changing and we kind of need to change along with it. And the importance of diplomats including many career fields into how they move along through the world and negotiate with other countries. So this will be all the time we have tonight for questions. Panelists, do you have any last messages you would like to share with us?
I would just say first, thanks for including me this evening in this great discussion, and to just, one of the things I think that makes America great is that I just look at the faces of the people who are here, is that we're a very rich and diverse country. And I encourage you to, one of the things that I think that has been what people in America can do, for example, that women in Tajikistan couldn't do. I used to, when I was the ambassador, have girls say to me, how do I become a diplomat? Well, becoming a diplomat in the US is a lot different than becoming a diplomat in Tajikistan, because you had to know somebody who knew somebody who was friends with the president to get a good job in the government. We don't have that kind of system. So I would just say, pursue your dreams and get as many experiences as you can. And if you find you're in international relations or whatever you're in and you want to change, don't be afraid to change either. It's never too late to start a new career. So.
Professor Boucher, Ms. Lalla, do you have any last words?
Go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say thank you. I'm really excited to be on this panel with people I know, people who I didn't know, and also to meet all of you. And I really want to thank the organizers, Kavya and Brian and Ethan, the others who sent us emails and things to get us organized here, and everybody for showing up on a Monday night. It's great to talk to you. I'm glad to hear you're interested in the field, that we have prospects of recruiting some of you, whether it's through Model UN or for something else. But send us a note someday and tell us where you end up. And if there's anything we can do for you along the way, feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, just to echo that, thank you so much for inviting me, allowing me to be a part of this panel with such esteemed panelists. Definitely been a privilege to have been here. And thank you to the team that organized this as well. My one piece of advice is just don't ever give up on yourself. Something's going to work out no matter what. Be confident, chase your dreams. And if you're interested in the field, you'll find your passion as you're going along it. It might not pop up in the beginning, but it's something that you'll cultivate over time. So be patient with yourself, be patient kind of as you're going through it. I know you all are going to achieve amazing things. Like I said, if you are interested in ever writing for the UNA-NCA blog, I am happy to coordinate that for any of you. If the coordinators of this panel want to give my email out, I'm more than happy to correspond with any of you, or learn more about what you guys are interested in. But yeah, thank you guys so much for being here tonight.
Thank you to all the panelists for all of your informative responses tonight and your wonderful closing remarks. Ambassador Elliott additionally has a brief slideshow which she would like to share with you all, and she will put that in the chat. On behalf of the whole BranchOut career panel team, we hope that everybody has enjoyed the panel this evening and learned a great deal about successful individuals in the field. We hope that everybody not only got a chance to learn more about international relations, but also have their questions answered and perhaps even be inspired to learn more about this field. International relations has been a vital part of our daily lives and will continue to be so for generations to come.
We are also extremely appreciative of our panelists, Richard Boucher, Susan Elliott, and Jaiya Lalla, for their time and giving us such great insight into this field. And of course, we are appreciative of our audience members for making this panel so great and asking some wonderful questions. To learn more about BranchOut and our future panels, please check us out at www.velbranchout.org or like us on Facebook at Veritas Education Leaders. We look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be on aviation. Sign up at the link below, and I will put all our social media links in the chat as well. Thank you, and that will be all that we have for tonight.
All right. Thanks, everybody. It's good to be with you. I'm going to log off now. Bye-bye.